The rain hammered down on the Western Front like bullets from the sky. Major Peter Nissen stood knee-deep in mud, watching British soldiers struggle to set up canvas tents in the freezing November wind of 1916. The Great War had been raging for 2 years, and thousands of men were dying not just from German shells, but from pneumonia and trench foot. The tents leaked. The wooden barracks took weeks to build. Men were suffering, and Nissen knew there had to be a better way. Peter Nissen was not a career soldier. Before the war, he had been a mining engineer in Canada and America, solving problems underground where mistakes meant death. Now, at 42 years old, he served with the Royal Engineers in France. His job was to build things fast under impossible conditions. But as he watched another tent collapse in the storm, soaking the men inside, he realized the British Army was fighting two enemies, the Germans in front of them and the weather all around them. That night, Nissen sat in a damaged French farmhouse, sketching by candlelight. He remembered the curved corrugated iron water tanks he had seen in mines. They were strong, simple, and quick to build. What if he could make a building the same way? He drew a half circle like a tunnel lying on its side. Corrugated iron sheets would form the roof and walls in one piece. No complicated joints. No skilled carpenters needed. Just bolt the sheets together and you had a shelter. His fellow officers laughed when he showed them the drawings. It looked like a giant tin can cut in half. How could something so simple work? But Nissen had seen too many men shivering in wet tents to care about pride. He convinced his commanding officer to give him 3 months and a small budget. If he failed, he would return to regular engineering duties. Nissen worked like a man possessed. He ordered corrugated iron sheets from British factories. He designed a wooden frame so simple that any soldier could assemble it with basic tools. The curved shape was perfect because it deflected wind and shed rain naturally. There were no weak points where roofs met walls because there was no separate roof. Everything curved together in one strong arch. WWII, February 1917. The first prototype stood in a muddy field behind the British lines. Nissen gathered 6 ordinary soldiers who had never built anything before. He gave them hammers, bolts, and simple instructions. For hours later, the hut was complete. Officers came from other units to see it. They could not believe their eyes. A building in 4 hours? Impossible. But there it stood, 16 feet wide and 30 feet long, ready to house 20 men. The real test came during a German artillery bombardment 2 weeks later. Shells landed near the camp, destroying tents and damaging wooden buildings. The Nissen hut shook from the blasts, but it held firm. Shrapnel bounced off the curved iron walls. Inside, soldiers stayed dry and relatively safe. Word spread fast through the British Army. Every unit wanted these huts. Production began immediately in Britain. Factories worked day and night, stamping out corrugated iron sheets. The design was so simple that even factories that had never made buildings before could produce the parts. Each hut came in pieces that fit together like a child's toy. No piece was too heavy for 2 men to carry. Everything could be loaded onto trucks or trains and shipped to the front. WWII summer of 1917, Nissen huts appeared everywhere along the Western Front. They served as barracks for troops, hospitals for wounded men, storage for ammunition, headquarters for officers, and even churches for Sunday services. The French countryside filled with these curved metal structures. From the air, British camps looked like rows of giant silver tunnels. The speed of construction amazed everyone. While German forces spent weeks building wooden barracks, British units could establish a complete camp in days. 6 untrained men could put up a Nissen hut before lunch. By evening, 20 soldiers had a weatherproof home. This speed saved lives. Medical units could set up field hospitals within hours of arriving at new positions. Wounded men no longer waited in the rain for shelter. American troops arrived in France in 1917 to help win the war. They saw the Nissen huts and asked British engineers for the plans. The design was so simple that it required only 1 sheet of instructions. American officers studied the huts carefully, making notes and taking measurements. They promised to remember this brilliant British invention. The war ended in November 1918. Over 100,000 Nissen huts had been built. They had housed millions of soldiers, stored countless tons of supplies, and saved thousands of lives. Major Peter Nissen received recognition for his design, but he remained humble. He had simply solved a problem the way any good engineer would, by making something simple, strong, and fast to build. After the war, many Nissen huts remained standing across Europe. Farmers used them for storage. Refugees lived in them. Towns converted them into community centers. The design was too good to abandon. But Nissen himself returned to civilian life, thinking his wartime invention would fade into history. He had no idea that 23 years later, another world war would make his curved metal huts more important than ever. Nor did he know that America would try to improve on his design, sparking a competition that would teach the military a hard lesson about engineering. The Nissen hut proved something important. In war, the best solution is often the simplest one. No fancy features. No complicated construction. Just solid engineering that works when lives depend on it. This lesson seemed obvious in 1918. But by 1941, it would need to be learned all over again. The explosion at Pearl Harbor shattered more than ships. On December 7, 1941, Japanese bombs destroyed the American sense of safety and thrust the United States into the largest war in human history. Within weeks, millions of young American men reported to military bases for training. The problem was simple and terrifying. Where would they all sleep? Lieutenant Commander John Elliott Farnham stood at Quonset Point Naval Station in Rhode Island, staring at a pile of blueprints. It was January 1942, and the temperature was below freezing. All across America, new military bases were springing up like mushrooms after rain. In California, Texas, Georgia, and dozens of other states, the Army and Navy needed buildings fast. Traditional wooden barracks took too long and required skilled carpenters who were already in short supply. Farnham knew about the British Nissen huts from the last war. His father had served in France and told stories about the curved metal shelters that went up in hours. The Navy had obtained British plans and studied them carefully. The design was brilliant in its simplicity, but Farnham and his fellow engineers believed they could do better. After all, this was America, the land of innovation and industrial might. Surely American engineering could improve on a 25-year-old British design. The team gathered around a large table in a cold warehouse. They spread out the Nissen hut plans and began suggesting improvements. The British design used bare corrugated iron, which made the huts cold in winter and hot in summer. Why not add insulation? The Nissen huts had dirt floors. Why not include wooden flooring? The British version had no windows, making the interior dark. Why not add window frames? Each suggestion seemed reasonable, and nobody questioned whether these improvements might create new problems. Over the next 3 months, the American team redesigned everything. They made the corrugated steel thicker and stronger. They added an interior layer of insulation board. They included pre-cut lumber for proper floors. They designed window and door frames that could be installed during assembly. They even improved the ventilation system and added electrical wiring channels. The result looked much more finished than the simple British hut. It was more comfortable, more permanent, more like a real building. WWII, April 1942, the first American hut stood complete at Quonset Point. They named it the Quonset Hut after the naval station where it was born. Officers toured the structure and smiled with satisfaction. It looked professional. It had real floors, real windows, and real doors. Inside, it felt almost like a regular building, not a temporary shelter. The Navy approved mass production immediately. Factories across America retooled to produce Quonset huts. Steel mills rolled out the corrugated sheets. Lumberyards cut the floorboards. Window manufacturers made the frames. It was an impressive display of American industrial power. By summer, Quonset huts were being shipped to military bases across the country and to war zones overseas. The Navy proudly told reporters that American engineering had created the perfect portable building. But there was a problem that nobody noticed at first. The British Nissen hut came in simple pieces that any 6 men could assemble with hammers and wrenches in 4 to 6 hours. The American Quonset hut arrived in more pieces, with more complex parts, requiring more tools and more time. The instruction manual was 12 pages long instead of one. The floor had to be built first, then the frame, then the metal sheets, then the insulation, then the interior finishing. What the British did in one simple step, the Americans had divided into 5 steps. Training crews practiced assembly at Quonset Point. The first hut took 16 hours with 10 men. After practice, they got it down to 12 hours with experienced builders. Still, that was twice as long as the British design, but American officers were not worried. The extra comfort was worth the extra time, they reasoned. Besides, American factories that could produce more huts to make up for slower construction. WWII late 1942, both designs were being shipped to war zones. British Commonwealth forces continued using Nissen huts in North Africa, India, and the Pacific. American forces received their new Quonset huts with pride. The first shipments went to Australia and New Zealand, where American troops were preparing to fight their way across the Pacific Islands toward Japan. On paper, everything looked perfect. American engineering had triumphed again. Nobody in Rhode Island knew that thousands of miles away, on jungle islands and desert coasts, the real test was about to begin. War does not care about blueprints or pride. War cares about what works when bullets are flying and men need shelter now, not tomorrow. The Quonset hut was about to face conditions its designers never imagined, and it would be judged not by how good it looked, but by how fast it went up under fire. Sergeant Mike Torres of the Marine Corps stood on a transport ship heading toward the Solomon Islands, looking at crates marked Quonset hut parts. He had never built one before, but he had heard they were easy to assemble. The Marines were going to need shelter fast when they landed. The Japanese controlled the islands, and every hour spent building was an hour exposed to enemy attack. Torres studied the instruction manual and frowned. 12 pages seemed like a lot for a temporary shelter. But orders were orders, and the Marines always found a way. As the ship moved through dark Pacific waters toward Guadalcanal, neither Torres nor the other Marines knew they were carrying more than building supplies. They were carrying an experiment in American engineering that was about to collide with the brutal reality of jungle warfare. The Quonset hut would finally face the test that mattered most. Could it be built fast enough to save lives? The answer would surprise everyone back in Rhode Island. The beach at Guadalcanal looked like hell on earth. Marines crouched behind palm trees and coral rocks while Japanese machine guns chattered from the jungle. It was August 1942, and America had launched its first major offensive in the Pacific. Sergeant Mike Torres and his construction battalion hit the beach 3 days after the initial landing. Their job was simple but dangerous. Build shelter for 10,000 men before the tropical rains came and Japanese bombers returned. Torres wiped sweat from his face and stared at the Quonset hut crates scattered across the sand. Enemy artillery had damaged several containers during the landing. Parts were mixed up. The 12-page instruction manual was soaked through and barely readable. His 10-man crew had never assembled a Quonset hut before. They had received exactly 2 hours of training back in San Diego. Now, with Japanese snipers in the trees and dark clouds gathering on the horizon, they had to figure out fast. The first problem appeared immediately. The Quonset design required a level foundation. On this beach, nothing was level. Coral rocks jutted up everywhere. The crew spent 2 hours clearing and leveling ground before they could even start the floor. Back in Rhode Island, designers had assumed construction would happen on prepared ground. Nobody told the Marines would be building on enemy beaches where bulldozers drew sniper fire. Torres and his men finally began assembly. Step 1. Build the wooden floor frame. The lumber was heavy and awkward. It took 4 men to position each piece. Step 2. Attach the metal base plates to the floor. The plates had specific positions marked in the instructions, but in the jungle heat and with shaking hands, the crew made mistakes and had to unbolt and reposition them. 3 hours passed. They had not yet touched the actual curved metal sheets that formed the walls and roof. About a mile down the beach, Australian engineers were assembling British Nissen huts for their troops. Torres watched them during a water break. The Australians had no floor to build. They simply cleared the ground, hammered stakes into the dirt, and started bolting curved metal sheets together. Their huts rose into the sky like magic mushrooms. Torres looked at his half-finished floor frame and felt frustration rising in his chest. By noon, the American crew was exhausted. The tropical sun turned the metal parts into griddles that burned hands even through gloves. The instruction manual said to install insulation panels before sealing the outer shell, which meant men had to work inside the partially assembled structure where the temperature reached 120 degrees. Two Marines collapsed from heat exhaustion. Torres sent them to the medical tent and pushed forward with 8 men instead of 10. The curved metal sheets were the trickiest part. The British Nissen design used overlapping sheets that were almost foolproof. The American Quonset sheets had to align precisely or they would not seal properly. In theory, this made a tighter building. In practice, on a beach with no proper tools and exhausted men, it meant spending an hour on joints that the British design would have completed in 10 minutes. Dark clouds rolled in faster than expected. Rain began falling at 3 in the afternoon. Not the gentle rain of America, but a Pacific downpour that felt like standing under a waterfall. The half-assembled Quonset hut offered no protection because the roof was not complete. Torres and his crew worked in the deluge, bolts slipping from wet fingers, feet sliding in mud. Water poured into the open structure, soaking the wooden floor they had spent hours building. The instruction manual dissolved into pulp. By nightfall, after 12 hours of brutal labor, the Quonset hut was 70% complete. Torres covered the open ends with tarps and posted guards. Japanese bombers sometimes struck at night, and an unfinished building made an easy target. His crew collapsed in exhaustion, sleeping in the mud because their shelter was not ready. Meanwhile, the Australians had finished 3 Nissen huts in the same time and were sleeping dry. The next morning brought worse news. A British liaison officer named Captain James Fletcher walked through the American construction area. Fletcher had served in France during World War I and knew the original Nissen huts well. He watched the Americans struggle with their complex design and shook his head. He approached Torres with a question that would echo through military reports for the rest of the war. "Sergeant, why are you making this so complicated? The British design goes up in 4 hours with 6 men. You have 10 men working 12 hours, and you are not finished." Torres wanted to argue, but he had no answer. Pride told him to defend American engineering. Experience told him the British officer was right. The Quonset hut was better in theory, more comfortable, better insulated, more permanent. But comfort meant nothing if you were sleeping in mud while waiting for your shelter to be finished. Over the next 3 months at Guadalcanal, the pattern repeated everywhere. American construction battalions struggled with Quonset huts, while British Commonwealth forces rapidly established complete bases with Nissen huts. The Australians, New Zealanders, and British moved like experienced teams. They could build a medical facility in a morning or a supply depot in an afternoon. The Americans spent days on projects that required hours with a simpler design. Field reports began flowing back to Washington. Marine commanders wrote blunt assessments. Quonset hut design too complex for combat conditions. Request British Nissen huts for future operations. Navy officers reported similar problems in the Mediterranean and North Africa. In Tunisia, American units actually requested British huts because sandstorms made the complex Quonset assembly nearly impossible. The most embarrassing moment came when Marines at one base secretly simplified their Quonset instructions. They stopped installing the wooden floors. They skipped the insulation. They ignored the window frames. Essentially, they rebuilt British Nissen huts using American parts. When their commanding officer saw 3 huts completed in 1 day instead of 1 hut in 3 days, he asked how they did it. The Marines sheepishly admitted they had thrown away most of the instruction manual. Torres finished his tour at Guadalcanal, having built 20 Quonset huts. The Australians next door built 60 Nissen huts in the same time. The math was simple and brutal. Back in Rhode Island, engineers had created a better building. On Guadalcanal, soldiers needed a faster building. In war, faster wins. Colonel James Harrison sat in the Pentagon surrounded by mountains of paper. It was March 1943, and the reports from every war zone told the same story with brutal honesty. The Quonset hut, America's pride and joy, was losing the race against the older British design. Harrison's job was to collect data, analyze it, and tell the generals something they would not want to hear. American engineering had failed to improve on British simplicity. The numbers were devastating. Harrison spread factory production reports across his desk. British factories produced a complete Nissen hut in 600 to 700 man-hours. American factories needed over 1,000 man-hours for each Quonset hut. The extra insulation, flooring, and window frames required more labor, more materials, and more time. Britain could build 3 huts while America built 2, using the same amount of workers and resources. But production was only the first problem. Transportation was worse. A Nissen hut broke down into simple corrugated sheets and a basic wooden frame. Everything stacked flat and light. One cargo ship could carry enough Nissen huts to house 5,000 men. The Quonset hut, with its lumber flooring, insulation panels, and complex frame parts, took up 40% more cargo space. In a war where every ship faced submarine attack and every ton mattered, that difference cost lives. Harrison moved to the combat reports. These were written by men under fire, and they did not care about hurting anyone's feelings. From Guadalcanal, Quonset assembly impossible under artillery fire. Request Nissen huts. From North Africa, sandstorms halt Quonset construction. British units complete bases in half the time. From Alaska, frozen ground prevents floor installation. Abandoning Quonset design for simplified British method. The most damning evidence came from assembly time tests. The Army had conducted controlled experiments at bases in California and Texas. They gave both designs to construction crews with equal training and identical conditions. The results were clear and consistent. 6 untrained soldiers could assemble a Nissen hut in 4 to 6 hours using only hammers and wrenches. 10 semi-skilled soldiers needed 8 to 12 hours to complete a Quonset hut, and they required specialized tools that often broke or went missing in combat zones. Harrison interviewed soldiers returning from the Pacific. They all said the same things. The Quonset hut was nicer once finished. It had real floors that stayed clean. It had windows that let in light. It had insulation that kept out some of the heat. But in jungle warfare where you built today or slept in mud tonight, nice did not matter. Fast mattat. Simple mattered. The British had understood this in 1916, and Americans were learning it again in 1943. The ultimate test came from an unexpected source. In February 1943, a typhoon hit the Solomon Islands. Winds reached 140 miles per hour. Both Nissen huts and Quonset huts faced nature's fury. Engineers studied the damage after the storm passed. The results surprised everyone. Both designs survived equally well. The curved shape that Peter Nissen had invented in 1916 was so aerodynamically perfect that adding insulation and interior walls made no difference. The extra American features provided no extra strength. They only added weight, cost, and construction time. Harrison compiled everything into a 200-page report. The conclusion was simple and embarrassing. The Quonset hut was over-engineered. It tried to be a permanent building when it only needed to be a temporary shelter. Every improvement American engineers added made the design worse for its actual purpose. The British had solved the problem perfectly in 1916. America spent time and money in 1941 making it more complicated without making it better. The political problem was obvious. How do you tell Congress that America wasted millions of dollars improving something that did not need improvement? How do you tell factories to stop making the American design and start making the British design? How do you admit that older and simpler was actually superior? The generals in the Pentagon faced a choice between pride and practicality. Meanwhile, in the field, soldiers had already made their choice. Harrison received photographs from various bases showing American crews ignoring official Quonset instructions. They removed the floor plans from the manuals. They skipped the insulation steps. They simplified the frame assembly. They were literally converting Quonset huts back into Nissen huts using American parts. Some units painted modified British design on their huts as a joke, but it was no joke. It was soldiers doing what soldiers always do, finding what works and ignoring what is not. British engineers watched this with quiet satisfaction, but no gloating. They had learned their lesson the hard way in 1916 when thousands of men suffered in inadequate tents. Major Peter Nissen, now retired and 69 years old, heard about the American situation and wrote a letter to the U.S. War Department. He was kind and diplomatic. He noted that the American improvements were clever in theory, but that war required different thinking. Speed saved lives. Simplicity won battles. Comfort could wait until the shooting stopped. The War Department made a quiet decision in mid-1943. They would continue producing Quonset huts for permanent bases in America and safe rear areas. But for rapid deployment in combat zones, they would order British Nissen huts directly from British factories. Some American factories would also produce Nissen huts under British license. The announcement never made newspapers. The American public would continue thinking the Quonset hut was a triumph of engineering. Only the soldiers knew the truth that by the end of 1943, both huts covered the globe. Over 150,000 Nissen huts and 170,000 Quonset huts had been built. But if you looked at where they were located, the story became clear. Nissen huts dominated the combat zones, Pacific Islands, North African deserts, and frontline positions in Italy. Quonset huts filled the safer areas. Training bases in America, supply depots in Australia, and rear headquarters far from fighting. The numbers had spoken. The soldiers had voted with their actions. British simplicity had defeated American complexity. The only question remaining was whether anyone would remember this lesson after the war ended, or whether future engineers would make the same mistake again. The war ended in 1945, but the curved metal huts remained. Across the world, on 6 continents and 1,000 islands, the shelters that housed millions of soldiers waited for their next purpose. Some would stand for another 80 years. Some would become homes, churches, and businesses. All of them would teach a lesson that each generation seems to forget. The best solution is often the simplest one that Mike Torres returned to California in 1946. The Marine sergeant who had sweated through Quonset assembly on Guadalcanal was now a civilian looking for work. He drove through the California countryside and saw something that made him smile. Farmers had bought surplus Quonset huts and turned them into barns. The metal structures were perfect for storing hay and equipment. But Torres noticed something interesting. The farmers had removed the floors and insulation. They had simplified the design, making it more like the British Nissen hut. Even in peacetime, people discovered that simpler worked better. Across America, thousands of surplus Quonset huts found new lives. In Kansas, a young couple bought one for $500 and turned it into their first home. They added a kitchen at one end and bedrooms at the other. The curved roof made the interior feel surprisingly spacious. In Montana, a small town converted 6 Quonset huts into a community center. In Mississippi, a church bought 3 and created a worship hall. The Quonset hut became a symbol of American post-war prosperity, even though most Americans never learned it was based on a British design. The British Nissen huts spread across the former British Empire. In India, they became schools. In Australia, they became sheep shearing stations. In New Zealand, they became storage facilities for the wool industry. In Africa, they sheltered refugees and became health clinics. The simple design proved incredibly adaptable. Because there were no interior walls or complex parts, people could modify Nissen huts easily for any purpose. The very simplicity that made them quick to build made them versatile in peace. Peter Nissen lived to see his invention circle the globe. He died in 1930, but his son and grandson watched the legacy grow. In 1975, Nissen's grandson visited a museum in England where they had preserved an original 1917 Nissen hut. Standing inside the curved metal structure, he felt the same awe that soldiers had felt 58 years earlier. The design was so simple that it seemed almost primitive, yet so clever that modern engineers still studied it. Engineering schools in the 1960s began teaching the Nissen versus Quonset case as a classic example of over-engineering. Professors showed students the two designs and asked which was better. Students always chose the Quonset at first. It had more features, more comfort, more everything. Then professors revealed the assembly times and costs. The lesson hit hard. Adding features is easy. Solving the actual problem is hard. The problem in 1916 was not comfort. It was speed. Nissen solved the real problem. American engineers in 1941 solved a different problem that nobody asked them to solve. The Cold War brought a new twist to the story. In the 1950s, both America and the Soviet Union needed rapid deployment shelters for military bases around the world. The Soviets studied both designs and chose to copy the British Nissen hut. Soviet engineers recognized the same truth that Allied soldiers learned. When you need shelter fast, simple beats complex. American military planners noticed this and quietly increased their orders for Nissen-style huts. Pride had delayed the lesson, but reality eventually won. Torres became a construction contractor after the war. He built houses across California for 30 years. In 1978, a young engineer asked him why he always designed houses with simple layouts and standard parts. Torres told him about Guadalcanal, about building in the rain, about watching Australians complete 3 huts while Americans struggled with one. The young engineer listened and changed how he approached design. This was how wisdom passed from one generation to the next, one story at a time. By the year 2000, both Nissen huts and Quonset huts had become historical artifacts. Modern military forces use sophisticated tent systems and modular buildings. But disaster relief organizations rediscovered the old designs. When earthquakes or tsunamis left thousands homeless, aid groups needed shelter fast. They studied wartime records and found the Nissen hut. Its simplicity made it perfect for emergency use. Crews with minimal training could build them quickly. Modern versions used better materials but kept the same basic curved design that Nissen invented in 1916. In 2015, a military historian conducted interviews with World War II veterans for a documentary. He asked them about the equipment they remembered most. Many mentioned weapons or vehicles, but several mentioned the huts. One 90-year-old Marine said something that summed up the entire story. The British hut was ugly but honest. It promised to go up fast and keep you dry, and it did. The American hut was pretty but complicated. It promised to be comfortable, but first you had to build it. In war, I wanted the ugly, honest one. The lesson continues to be relevant. In 2024, military engineers designed new rapid deployment shelters for humanitarian missions. The debate was the same as in 1941. Should they add features to make the shelters more comfortable or keep them simple to make them faster to build? Some engineers pushed for complex designs with climate control and integrated technology. Others argued for simplicity and speed. The argument will never end because every generation of engineers faces the same temptation to improve things that already work. Today, a few original Nissen huts still stand in England, preserved as historical monuments. A handful of Quonset huts remain in America, used as storage buildings or converted into quirky homes. Both designs served their purpose and served it well, but history remembers them differently. The Nissen hut represents the brilliance of solving exactly the problem at hand with no wasted effort. The Quonset hut represents the danger of overthinking, of adding features that solve problems nobody asked you to solve. Peter Nissen taught the world a lesson in 1916 that apparently needs to be learned again every few decades. When lives depend on your design, make it simple, make it fast, make it reliable. Leave the fancy features for peacetime. War does not care about comfort. War cares about what works right now. That simple truth outlasted both world wars and remains true today. Sometimes the best engineering is knowing what not to add.